Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It's finally here. This video has been cooking in the oven for a few weeks now because it was so long and I'd had to cross-check with a bunch of people on how to even create this video. But as you see from the title, the algorithm decided to throw a bunch of Iceberg videos at me a few weeks ago. And when I started exploring some genres of content, I thought, yeah, you know what? Theorycrafting Iceberg would be a good video idea. It hasn't been done yet, so, why not? Unlike other icebergs of this genre, this wouldn't be too specific to certain characters, but can work as a general guide and how much you know from a casual all the way to a Theorycrafter. As you'll notice when we go down each level of the iceberg, we will be using concepts from the previous tiers of the iceberg to simulate the progression of someone that goes from absolutely zero game knowledge of HSR all the way to being a full-blown Theorycrafter that invents new team comps and min-maxes teams unfathomed by the common person, even myself. With that out of the way, let's get started. For this video, let's say there is a casual with no idea how the game works given a max level account that has a number of characters. This is a level 1 player, in which most casual players reside, and is the bare minimum of what you need to know to progress through the story comfortably, but has absolutely no idea how to do any endgame, so they only just tackle story content. First, the casual will start off at character logic. Aside from the general controls of the game, the first thing you ever know about Star Rail gameplay is what the characters do individually and their general profile. This takes precedence over the battle system most times. Since casual content is so easy, you don't even need to learn the combat system too bad. The first thing you learn about character logic is the paths and roles. This is the most basic knowledge you can learn about any character from a combat perspective. Using my account as an example, let's say the first character a casual instantly notices is Dr. Ratio. Dr. Ratio is a hunt character, and after the person testing it uses Ratio and reading some tutorials, they will notice that Dr. Ratio has a pretty good amount of damage. It is understood at this point, even for the casual, that Dr. Ratio's role is a damage dealer, but really nothing any more deep than that. The casual may also understand through in-game tutorials the path system and what the other paths do. Agility has debuffs, Harmony has buffs, Erudition is AoE, etc, etc, which can help set a precedence or expectation to other characters. The next thing that the casual will learn is damage types. The casual may notice that Dr. Ratio uses follow-up attacks, which acts differently to basic attacks and other skills. They may also notice that Dr. Ratio is imaginary, which not every character is. And they may also notice that Dr. Ratio scales off attack when they read his skills. And the casual may like the bigger bump in damage once the crit hit text shows up. They may also notice that sometimes they don't follow up because there's no debuffs. This rudimentary knowledge can help them understand that Dr. Ratio is a bit different since his element, damage type, and scaling is different to some characters, allowing them to apply certain decisions later on. The next is basic build synergy. Taking those basic concepts, the casual can understand at a base level, Dr. Ratio has leaning to certain builds that don't really apply to others. Understanding he's a hunt character with follow-ups that like crit, without knowing the exact numbers of what is actually better, any player can pretty much guess on their own that Stellar Cruise is good on him. Ratio can probably use an imaginary damage orb because he is imaginary. Pioneer is pretty good too since he does apply some debuff, and so is Salsoto or Glamoth. A casual player cannot explain how much better these builds are by a certain percentage, but anyone that pays a second of attention can assume what is a logical build at a baseline just on instinct alone. And once a player has reached this point of knowledge for one character, they can start applying it to more characters until they learn enough basics of characters to form a full team. Team Logic 1. Base Archetypes. If you are an avid role-playing game player, you might already know what and how this works. But say that someone that plays honkaistarrail is their first RPG, I don't know how that would happen, and they have never seen a turn-based combat system before, this is how they would learn from scratch. You'd start using characters that you like together and then realize there's some combinations that are better or worse. First of which you will immediately notice is that if the enemy hits hard enough, which is expected at a casual level, you probably want a healer character or a shielder at all times. Then, you may notice that using buffers will do bigger damage to your DPS, and using two supports together gives a bigger number to your DPS, firing the neurons to tell you that what you're doing is the right thing. This is the tried and true hypercarry team that many people who have no RPG experience can figure out actually on their own without much deep thought. It's kind of an immersive emergent thought that even if you don't play RPGs, you will naturally lead to this conclusion. However, some people can take another route and start with multi-DPS archetypes instead. Base archetypes are so simple and effective that you can pretty much logically tie any team that exists into these archetypes like a family tree. Basic synergies, or as some people would like to call it, basic team building. Once you have a grasp of basic archetypes, you then start to look into basic synergy. Yes, you may have learned that putting a support with Dr. Ratio will render him better results, but you can't just put in any buffer, and some are noticeably better on him than others. Following this logic and looking at the bare mechanics of the characters, it wouldn't actually be a hard jump to choose Robin as the best over someone like Asta, since she gives bigger numbers and seems to put out really good additional damage. Even if you aren't an expert on Starrail, you would have a spark of instinct that these units are synergistic and some units are worse than Robin. Then you start thinking of the condition that Dr. Ratio has. He wants debuffs. Motza and Topaz put on a debuff, and Topaz enables follow-up damage. Then the sustain. Aventurine seems to really like follow-ups and lands a debuff too. Makes sense that he would be the best defensive option and you would put them together in the team. This is basic level synergy. Other examples include Akron with Jiao Cho, Firefly with Ron Mei, Kafka with Black Swan. While for us it is obvious and shallow, these are all entry points to go into deeper theory crafting and experimentation that every player goes through. Even if you don't know any of the numbers, you could still make these assumptions and make correct decisions on how to min-max your team. Basic turn order theory. Basic turn order theory is the concept of which characters could afford to go faster and who could afford to go slower. For example, you probably noticed that Tingyun wants to move really fast compared to your DPS, so she could put on buffs on your DPS before they get to act. Your shielder and healers may need to be fast in case the enemy gets too aggressive. Clara can stay slow because most of her damage comes from countering, it seems. This is all variant from team to team and evolves later on to more complex topics, which makes it a fundamental that many people can learn incidentally when they try to min-max. Then we move on to battle logic, which is all about execution and knowledge about the actual combat system. Just as a note, up until this point you can still clear honkaistarrail story, maybe with a little bit of difficulty that will force you to dip a little deeper into your bag of tricks. But it should still be achievable to clear honkaistarrail story without knowing any of the things past this point. First, skill point use. Once you interact with the skill point system, you may learn the basic min-maxing of skill points and reach conclusions based on that. You don't need to use skill points on healers that don't need to heal. You want most DPS to skill as much as possible. You want supports to minimize skill point use to simply buff reapplication. Skill points are a finite resource, and you notice some characters do a lot more with skill points than other characters using skill points would do. This is one of the first steps to actually learning how to play optimally. Enemy weakness and resistance. The other thing you learn is the weakness and resistance system. You will most likely notice if you use a character long enough that they start hitting less on a certain enemy. Wondering what this is, you discover through the status page that they are resistant to that character's element, and you probably feel the need to switch out your character to actually clear the fight faster. This too is a gateway to min-maxing. Though you don't really get why there's different elements or if each element is better than the other, you just know that matching weaknesses does the bigger number and helps you survive better, which is pretty cool. Basic enemy mechanics. An example of this would be the Aventurine story boss. While you don't know the exact patterns of his damage or any of his attack patterns, you may be forced to learn that you need some form of AoE to survive the gamble mechanic. And so to not die, you bring some form of AoE characters. Sunday boss, you do breaks to get shields and survive. For the swarm, you try to defeat them all at one swoop to prevent them from reviving. Again, this is one of the first experiences of min-maxing actual gameplay and is pretty important if you're trying to get into Theorycrafting. Then we go on to level 2, which is the level of consistent endgame players. Past this point, you don't actually need any of this to clear story, absolutely. But you do need some grasp of these concepts to clear consistently all the endgame content. I'm sure many of you watching this are at this level of knowledge, and you should all be proud that you've made it past this point. First, character logic, section 2. First of these concepts is aggro and energy. One of the more hidden concepts of the game is aggro and how energy works. In your first trip to endgame, you may have heard the piece of advice where you position your characters in a certain way to maximize survivability. efficiency. There's also a way to maximize energy and damage. This is what aggro and energy talks about. Taunt values can give you just a bit of an advantage in terms of energy that can sometimes make or break your run, and thus many endgame players just do it on instinct without really thinking about it too often. Especially as one of the introductory min-maxing advice. Learning energy also allows you to figure out how much turns a character needs to ult, and how exactly an energy regeneration rope can actually influence that, which helps to better building of your characters. The complete damage formula. While some endgame players never fully understand the damage formula or how to use it, knowing what it looks like and what a multiplier does is another piece of fundamentals. If you can apply the damage formula, you will know how some buffs are fairly abundant, how buffs exactly interact with certain abilities, and how some buffs can't even apply to certain characters. This piece of knowledge leads way to the next thing, stat saturation. This is a topic that I have covered in one of my theorems, the Jingliu theorem. Thanks to the concept of opportunity cost, some characters get less of a certain buff if they already buff themselves with it very high. Firstly, a character may receive tremendous increases due to the lack of self-buffs. Thus, you develop a cognition to realize that some characters are better at buffing a certain character than other characters when it usually would not be the case. For example, Bronya is better at buffing Jingliu even though Sparkle would usually be a better buffer for everyone else. And this is because Jingliu likes damage percent more than crit damage. The concept of stat saturation naturally evolves from learning the damage formula as well as this other concept. Next is advanced build synergy. In basic build synergy, you can assume that Doctor Ratio is fine with an imaginary orb, attack rope, and certain sets based on observation without really any math. In advanced build synergy, using the damage formula, you can accurately gauge how much bigger is an imaginary orb over an attack orb. Does an attack just actually work, or is it really that bad? How big of a percentage gap it is to use Pioneer over something like Valorous? How much percentage and substats you need for Salsoto over Duran? Understanding advanced build synergy can really rack up and allow you to run teams that are 12% better when it doesn't really seem like it, and can put into perspective how much you really need certain light cones and other build investments. Next is unique multipliers. Unique multipliers have seen additions over the time, and you kinda just learn it through trial and error, but basically unique multipliers usually have a unique place in the damage formula and scalings that are unconventional than, let's say, direct buffs like attack buffs or damage percent buffs. The first example is Defense Shred. It is unique because the more you have it, mathematically its value gets higher until you reach the cap of 100%. Super Break has its own formula and interacts with only debuffs, and not all buffs like attack or damage percent really work on it. Acheron's Trace passive is its own separate multiplier that nobody else has. Unique multipliers are many, and I can't name them all in this video. Again, it's a trial and error thing, but learning unique multipliers over time allows a deeper understanding of how to get the most out of a character. We now move on to team logic. Much like character logic, team logic 2 will further explain how teams work or how much you can make teams work. The first is speed charts and speed tuning. Speed is a pretty complicated topic. A lot of people actually don't know how exactly it works, but they do know infamous breakpoints such as 128, 134, and 161 speed. Speed charts illustrate how these breakpoints influence your amount of turns, which increase your damage over cycles. Like how 128 speed gives you an extra turn on the first cycle, and how 134 speed gives it to you on the 0 cycle instead. Because honkaistarrail is an action value-based system, these are all pretty important to learn in maximizing your scores in endgame. The other side of this is also speed tuning. The most famous case of this is Bronya. Bronya's skill provides an immediate turn advance, which means if she's at least 1 less speed than a damage dealer, you can simply use her skill again to advance the DPS that just took their turn, and essentially take another turn to double their damage. That 1 speed bit of difference enabled that to happen. So you can see how for some characters, speed tuning is practically a requirement and can cascade to huge damage increases. SP mapping and team SP efficiency. Once you figured out how to speed chart, you can also map out speed and figure out how viable a team is in SP efficiency. Oftentimes in this game, needing to do a basic attack on a damage dealer is an active grief since it just leads to a bigger damage loss. But if you can map out how SP positive a character is, you can create a perfect balance where your DPS can keep up with skill point eating comfortably. Understanding this can lead you to appreciate characters like Gallagher or Pela more and realize flaws with high SP usage supports. It's a pretty big deal for gameplay and also in evaluating characters in theory crafting. Specific team optimizations. Like the name suggests, some teams have specific buff combinations that would make some builds better than the norm. Since Bronya gives so much damage percent and Blade already has a lot of damage percent, for example, you actually will see better results with an HP orb on Blade when he would usually just use wind damage boost. This ties into stat saturation and the damage formula that we already discussed. For Jade teams, you will start using attack boots instead of speed boots, since Jade provides enough speed to actually replace those boots. For break teams, you may even consider break effect builds even on crit characters. This also applies to technique sequencing, how you can maximize your technique usage before battle. Judging which techniques to use can be a pretty big deal in some teams, and of course in low cycle clears. Now we move on to Battle Logic 2, and the first of which is break optimization. Like it says on the tin, break optimization is being able to gauge how much toughness damage you can do at the correct time to get the right amount of break or who triggers it. Boothill and Luca are notorious users of break optimization, as their break damage as physical characters is extremely high. In Boothill's case, trick shot stacks are huge to min-max, and a lot of his damage actually hinges on him being the one that breaks. For Luca, his identity as a break DOT detonator is fully reliant on maximizing who actually triggers the break, which is him. Break optimization is not only an offensive tool you can use though. Action advance, delay, and cancel. Here is where most of the player base I think starts to fall off in learning theory crafting. Action delay and cancel are pretty self-explanatory. As mentioned earlier, breaks are not only offensive. The break state itself is a crowd control, and you can cancel enemy turns for defensive purposes. Action delay is much of the same concept. Delaying if a boss is taking 2 turns means you don't really get anything, since the enemy is just going to take their second turn for the same action value anyway. Action advance is heavily misunderstood. However, it cannot be stressed enough how overpowered this mechanic is, and correctly tuning action advance could get you just a lot of results. Whether you're an E6 whale or not, action advance is one of the only ways you can directly increase damage if you know how to use it. Action advance alone could take its own 5-minute video to explain, and I've kind of already went into that with a For Dummies video. There's multiple videos about it that can explain it better than I do, so I advise you to seek it out because it really does make so much of a difference once you get the hang of it. Speed updates. Directly tied to action advance, you may notice in some cases that your character is slower than expected despite buffing their speed, and some get faster for apparently no reason. This is the fault of speed updates, and how exactly you can play around it can be a big deal. When speed buffs wear off, the next turn that they will have takes more action value to do, and when speed buffs are put on, the next turn they will have gets slightly faster than it seems. Again, this is a pretty simple example of what it entails, and there's a bunch of videos that explain speed already, so I suggest you just check those out instead of me trying to butcher an explanation about it. Next, buff, debuff duration, and timing. This also influences the previous speed updates concept. Some buffs, under some scenarios, can be squeezed out for more value than you would do it a different way. For example, Blade can extend Bronya's ult buff by 1 turn because of the unique properties of his skill enhance. Characters can lose a speed buff faster since it ticks down at the start of the turn rather than the end, which can mess up relics like Gamoth or actually make relic sets like Hackerspace useless because it's only 1 turn. Debuffs are the same way. If you apply debuffs during enemy turns, they are 1 turn longer than applying it before that turn happens. Just another point of min-maxing for endgame. Now we enter section 3. These are the depths to which it is absolutely not necessary at all and is reserved to people that really want to cook as theory crafters. If you just want to clear endgame, learning up to section 2 is perfectly fine, but there's no turning back once you've gone on this path to become a quote-unquote real theory crafter, I guess. This is the level of the sweats. These are not only endgame players, they are just hardcore of the hardcore players. We're not going to be discussing character logic because I can't really think of any more advanced concepts in terms of individual characters. So we'll be moving on to Team Logic 3. Team-specific counters to specific enemy lineups. This can be seen as a culmination for a bunch of team building exercises. For example, the current apocalyptic shadow against Kafka, you have multiple mechanics going on here. Kafka spams crowd control, there's multiple enemy weaknesses and resistances, and the summoning mechanic here is pretty different. With this, you can figure out that Ruan Mei practically destroys this fight given the correct weakness type damage dealer or follow-up damage dealers that not only do the turbulence well, but do toughness damage as well. And for sustain, Aventurine can prevent crowd control, or you can use Gallagher to break and cleanse instead as an alternative. These ideas are specific to this one Kafka boss, and in any other enemy the knowledge may not apply, or you may have to change some elements of the team just to suit the boss. Again, this is an application of knowledge. Everything you've learned about team building gets used in this concept. Instead of just relying on good old brute forcing, you have a deeper understanding of the game, which allows you to even get away with less expensive options, and that's pretty much how 4-star only clears are born from. Action value mapping. A sort of culmination of learning speed is being able to map action value. Again, like the previous one, this is a long in-depth topic and I pretty much explained it already. Charting is the end result of understanding the concept of action advance and speed, and this is basically to show your work to other theory crafters. Basic damage simulation spreadsheets. This also is one of the culminating end products. Damage simulation spreadsheets take together everything you know specifically about a character, a team, their battle optimization, the damage formula, speed, almost everything that you've learned before this point is needed to create a basic damage simulation spreadsheet. Understanding all of these concepts and doing it well is a pretty good indication that you know nearly everything about the game. Nearly. Battle Logic 3, Dynamic Enemy HP Breakpoints. Often found for units like Zilla, Fei Xiao, and Butil, knowing when an enemy will die based on how much max HP they have and how much damage you can get away with using that information can lead to more extra actions or faster ramp up. Casual players may actually have a bit of inkling how to do dynamic HP breakpoints and maximize it if they play Zilla long enough, but they can't really explain it exactly why or what that breakpoint is. If you have a good understanding of dynamic HP thresholds, you can gauge where this is and even cook up some dastardly builds like Thief Argenti or ERR Rope on DPS units. Again, you probably have a slight knowledge of this and that is enough for most content, like not wasting an Acheron ult if the enemy's HP is low enough and save it for the next wave is pretty simple and you can explain that pretty easily. But if you really want to cook and get some wacky runs in, then you probably want to know about dynamic enemy HP breakpoints. Next is RNG energy optimization. This is one of those niche things that kind of a lot of endgame players do a lot of the time, but can't really pinpoint it or are willing to actually use it. If you've seen a clear video of MOC using a really impressive looking team, you may see some text about Gallagher needs to get hit to get energy on this specific enemy, otherwise the run is dead or takes a cycle longer. This is a point of RNG energy optimization. If the run can hinge on someone specifically getting hit to increase its performance in a pretty substantial way, and you can actually pinpoint this choke point, then you know what this is and how effective it can be. This may also include not getting hit or spreading out hits for no sustain runs. Again, many impressive clear videos of really good teams are employing these min-maxing strategies to do the highest score and can make a world of difference on units in general, like Robin. Endgame high score optimization. This includes your low cycle clears, low AV clears on Apocalyptic Shadow, 0 cycle on Pure Fiction, max score, whatever. This is the end result of everything you've learned on this Iceberg so far. From the basics of the character to concepts like speed and then specific enemy counters and much more. If you manage to use everything you've learned so far and apply it to current endgame cycles, you can get away with cheaper teams to min-max simply because you know and play better than what is necessary to get the rewards. And for that, big respect to you, because if you've reached this point, practically everything you ever need to actually know about endgame can stop here, and at this point you can simply just start learning about new characters and analyze how good they are. But wait, it's not over yet. The Unknowable Domain. Yes, we're not done yet. These are concepts that are so obscure that I think most viewers, actually I don't think any of you guys will actually understand what I'm saying or what these even are after I explain it. And my explanations may not be able to explain it probably because I also don't understand most of the things that go into these concepts. So I'll explain to you the main concept of it as much as I could. And again, I may be wrong about it or I'm just explaining it poorly. So bear with me here. This is the absolute depths of what you can go in theory crafting. RNG crit analysis. You may hear practically 90% of the player base, including myself, say that 70-130 or 80-110 crit ratio is a good enough stopping point and are the same crit value in essence. But this concept actually goes deeper. How much better is a crit ratio actually using multiple statistical formulas? Because if we're being technical, 80-110 is completely different from 70-130 and is better most of the time, and sometimes it's worse. So how much exactly are these percentages where it's better or worse? Spoiler, it's not a flat number and is pretty complicated because it uses multiple formulas and has multiple considerations than what people have you thinking that crit rate times crit damage is the same crit value. But anyway, if you manage to analyze through black magic that I cannot understand myself, you can assume if a certain crit ratio is more effective. And you also have to consider in this concept too, the concept of hit splits, because some hits are better than others and some characters have more hits than others. Again, there's a lot you could... Did I explain this concept clearly enough? Okay, here's a TLDR since I'm getting lost in my own sauce. Basically, RNG crit analysis is more precise analysis of crit chances that involves more concepts like hit counts, splits, and proper rate calculation. Auto battle, reverse engineering, and optimization. This is a concept that isn't directly tied to mathematical concepts or any formulaic solutions. So what's the big deal? Why is this in the unknowable domain? What makes auto battle reverse engineering special is, well, you actually have to look at StarRail's code for your research. It's kind of a topic that's gone under the radar simply because of that aspect. You can't really talk about dissecting code in most StarRail servers, especially for auto battling. Even in theory crafting groups, this isn't a thing that you usually see. At least with leaks, you have something to gain, but auto battling is so niche that this isn't even talked about in any server by rules or just by the absolute redundancy of it. Granted, there is surface level auto battle optimization, but there are certain things that you may not be able to plan or even know about without knowledge of the game's coding. Because of that, it wallows in the unknowable domain. It's just too niche to touch and probably isn't worth getting blacklisted for a content creator to talk about it. Last, build analysis. You may have seen my previous most popular video actually about why your build does low damage, and I explicitly mentioned there that I cannot give you advice on which aspect of your build you should go for in terms of efficiency. This concept is the direct answer to that question. Build analysis tackles questions of investment, like how long does it take to max out your traces? That is a bit simple to explain, because even with RNG drops, traces have a capacity limit of how much time you can spend to get that much. You can simply take the amount of stamina that you needed to max out your traces and transform that into time taken, which is about around 2 weeks or so. Without overcapping fuel, you can get max traces of a certain character. Now, what about relic RNG and how long it takes to get a certain relic? Then we get to the good stuff, right? How likely are you to get a certain combination of substats within a certain amount of rolls? How likely are you to roll into those substats? How likely are the set probabilities? It is theoretically possible to figure all this out and find a certain time frame in which you can achieve a certain quality of build or relics. There's some preliminary of the results, like how many weeks it might take to get a certain quality of a relic, but that isn't perfect either, of course. If we have enough research and provide some good reference points, then maybe one day we can actually come up with the most optimal fuel spending and figure out when the cutoff point is on traces and when you can start working on your relics. And all those questions like that can be answered by build analyses. And honestly, it's kind of disappointing that we don't have a result to this because I feel like it's the most useful information in the world, especially for newbies. And there you go, that's the deepest Honkai Star Rail theory crafting iceberg explained. As icebergs melt, new topics probably will show up over time in this iceberg, and let's be real, I probably missed some concepts too, but I feel as though we've dragged off long enough. This took so long to script, it was 2 weeks, and I hope the effort that I made showed through in this video, and I hope you guys share it so at least my work was for something. Anyway, I hope you guys liked this video. Do all the algorithm stuff, like, comment, subscribe, and if you didn't like it, you can go ahead and press that dislike. Share it all around, and I'll see you later. Bye bye. Finally, this video is over, Jesus.